Good morning, History 131. I hope everyone had a great weekend and looking forward to a good week. Uh, Today and this week we'll be talking about the Greek experience. The Greeks are part of the mass migration of Indo-Europeans, white people, from Central Asia along the Caucasus Mountains. The Greeks are part of this mass movement. We've already talked about the Aryans in India, the Persian in Iran. Now this would be our third Indo-European group. Let's look at Greece. Of course, Greece is in Asia, in Europe. Uh, their culture is different from other cultures that we have talked about, particularly the Mesopotamian, the Indians, Indus, the Egyptian. They were preoccupied with religion. But the Greeks are similar to the Chinese. Uh, they strove to understand in logical terms the universe and the position of man within it. The result was the birth of Western philosophy and science in Europe. These subjects were far more important to the most Greek thinkers than religion. So they were more secular or worldly than spiritually. Now, as you know, they do get into religion, but it's more mythology than actual belief system. So the Greek, the history of the Greeks is divided into two broad periods. The Hellenic period, that's the time between the arrivals of the Greeks about 2500 BCE, and the victory over the Greeks by the Macedonian Philip of Macedonia, and the Hellenistic age, which was ushered in by Philip's son Alexander the Great, and ending with the Roman conquest of the Hellenistic East. Hellas, the land, was what the ancient Greeks called their land. It encompassed the Aegean Sea and its islands as well as the Greek peninsula. Now, you remember the definition of a peninsula? Surrounded by water on three sides. An island surrounded on all sides. But Greece, the mainland of Greece, is a peninsula that jerks out from Europe. It breaks off from an extension of the Balkan Mountains. And because of this geographical fragmentation, it encouraged political fragmentation. Now, no one knows exactly when the Greek speaking people made Greece their home. Probably the early Greeks merged with the natives, and from that union emerged a society scholars refer to as Mycenaeans. The information about this period is taken from the great epic poems of Homer called the Iliad and the Odyssey. We're going to talk more about that in a few minutes. To the south of the peninsula of Greece is an island called Crete, Crete. It housed the famous Minoan culture. The Minoan occupied Crete from the Neolithic period. They developed a written language called Linear A, which has never been discipled. The main palace was located at Knossos, and it was the center of the Minoan society. This period of the Mycenaeans and the Minoans was known as the Bronze Age of Greece. The Mycenaean also developed a script called Linear B. Contact between the Minoans and Mycenaeans were originally peaceful. Later, around 1450 BCE, the Mycenaean attacked Crete and destroyed the grand palace of Knossos. After destroying the culture, the Mycenaeans destroyed themselves in a long series of civil war. The fall of the Mycenaean kingdom ushered in a period of poverty, disruption, and backwardness that is called the Dark Ages of Greece. Still, this period was important to the development of the Greek civilization. It was a time of widespread movement of Greek-speaking people. A great wave of Greeks spread eastward through the Aegean to the coast of Asia Minor. These immigration turned the Aegean Sea into a Greek lake. So how do we know about all of this? Mainly it comes from the writing of Homer and his two poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Now, we cannot authenticate the writing of Homer, but it left a lasting impression upon the Greeks. But he used oral tradition to compose the Iliad, which is the epic of the Trojan War. Everyone has seen the movie, I'm sure, hopefully, about the Iliad. The Greeks finally won and sacked the city of Troy. Let's start. How does this war start? Well, it's about love. The prince of Troy falls in love with Helen of Greece. She's the wife of the Spartan king. She falls in love and goes back to Troy with him. The Greeks are embarrassed and accuse the Trojan of kidnapping his wife. Thus began the long war between the Greeks and the Trojans of Troy. They laid siege to the city. Many heroes developed during this particular time. One stands out is Achilles. That should ring a bell, the Achilles tendon. Achilles was a warrior that was feared on the battlefield. He could not be killed by a single arrow or sword. The only way he could be killed would be an arrow to his heel, where his Achilles tendon, the strongest tendon in the body. That's how he dies. But eventually, the Greeks packed up with the intention of sailing back home, leaving the city of Troy. They load their ship up, but before they leave, they build a big wooden horse. Once the Greek ship leaves the port, the Trojan pushed the horse within the walls of the city and began to celebrate their victory. All night long, they partied, drink, revelry. Eventually, by dawn, everybody had partied out and was asleep. At that particular time, men came out of the horse, the Trojan horse, and conquered the city. The Trojan is synonymous with a deception. The Greeks had deceived the Trojan, and by that deception, they conquered Troy, which is in modern day Turkey. That's the Iliad. Remember what I told you. It started over love. Helen of Troy versus Agamemnon. Now, the second portion of the epic poem is the Odyssey. The Iliad deals with the Trojan War. The Odyssey deals with King Odysseus returning home to his beloved Penelope. After the war, King Odysseus is sailing back to Greece. He's in the harbor. He sees his beloved Penelope on shore. He blows her a kiss. The gods get involved and throws Odyssey off course, and he began to travel around the Mediterranean to the island of the Cyclops, the Sirens. You've seen the movie. He runs into the brutal female monster Medusa, the head with snakes. You view the head, you turn to stone. So Odyssey conquered Medusa and beheads her. He finally makes it back home to his beloved Penelope. The Iliad and Odyssey are simple love stories that takes in battles and epic conflict. But the Greeks regarded the Iliad and Odyssey as their authentic history and as the work of one poet. The masterpiece gave the Greeks an ideal past with the legendary age of heroes and heroines, and it became used as a standard text for the education of generational Greek males to come, and even today. When I was in high school, I read the Iliad and Odyssey, I believe, in the ninth grade. Have you read these epic poems? Are you familiar with them? So, to later generation of Greeks, these heroic values form the core of aristocratic virtues. The fact that explained the tremendous popularity of Homer as an educational tool. Homer gave the Greeks a universal accepted model of heroism, honor, and nobility. So, the epic poems, the Iliad and Odyssey by Homer, will appear at least 3, 4, 5 times on your next test. So become very familiar with that. Now, after the Messenians, Minoans, and the conflict with the Trojans ended, we turned back to Greece itself. The Greeks had developed, it was fragmented, so they developed what we call city-state, polis, or polis. The word politics came from this word, the polis. It was the town and a city surrounded by the countryside. People would go out at night, at day, and farm and come back at home at night to live within the city. Everything centered around the city. There are two major city-states that we're going to talk about in depth. That would be Athens and Sparta. But both were city-states. In Athens, they spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to govern. They experimented with tyranny, a monarch ruled by one, an oligarchy ruled by a few, a tyranny ruled by one, a dictatorship. Eventually, they came up with a system called democracy, and this was developed by a man named Clearstein, which simply means ruled by the people. This form of government is broadly used today and was developed by the Greeks. So the term democracy came from the Greeks. So that's in Athens. Now in Athens, it was surrounded by a wall, but in the middle of the town was the agora. This was the shops where you went to shop and talk and visit and socialize, but also public bath. Nudity was common. It was the Greeks felt like a human body was something to prize and not to hide and disguise with clothing. So public bathing was common. At the top of the town stood the Acropolis. This is where the temples of the Greek gods and goddesses was built, and people went to worship their gods and goddesses. So don't forget the Agora, shopping, and the Acropolis, the hill where the temples lie. Now, it was in the Agora where the debate over the forms of government took place, and this is where the Greeks came to be entertained. Now, Sparta was completely different. They was isolated in the southern part of Greece on the Peloponnesian coast. The Spartan instituted a series of reform called the Liturgic Reform, and they transferred themselves into a perpetual military camp. The lives of the Spartans were organized and controlled. At birth, each child was examined by state officials and decided whether he or she was fit to live. Boys were taken from their mothers at the age of 7 and put under control of the state and forced to live in barracks and become soldiers. At 30, the Spartan male were recognized as mature and allowed to vote in the assembly and live at home, but they remained in the military service until the age of 60. While their husband was in the military barracks, Spartan women lived at home. Because of this separation, Spartan women had greater freedom and movement and greater power in the household that was common for women elsewhere in Greece. Like the men, Spartan women engaged in athletic exercise in the nude. At solemn feasts, the young women marched naked in procession, and in the presence of the young men, they sang songs about those who showed gallantry. Many Spartan women upheld the strict Spartan value, expecting their sons to be brave in war. To make this new military state secure, the Spartans turned their back on the outside world. They would not allow visitors to come in, and basically it was a self-contained. In the 6th century, the Spartans used their military might and gained control of the Peloponnesian, and they turned one group into slaves, helots. So their practice of slavery was in particular. Now, Athens is the complete opposite. It's more cultural, it's more refined. They're more interested in man's role on earth than the afterlife. They turned their back on Sparta. So this is where democracy developed, and this is where the high point of Greek civilization, or classical Greece, arise. But that was a challenge. The Persian, remember Cyrus the Great, the Persian Empire had been in existence for 200 years. They decided that the Greeks was a challenge. Cyrus the Great grandson, Xerxes, led a massive invasion force into Greece and burned the city of Athens. But it was the heroic of Spartan king Leonidas that led the 300. You've seen the movie The 300, right? The Path. They held the Persian army at bay until the Greek navy could recapitulate and defeat the Persian. The 300. Watch that movie. It's a true story. Now, the reason we know about this is because of the world's first historian, Herodotus. He wrote the history of the Persian War. So they turned the Persians back. The Greeks now realized they had to unite to prevent another invasion force from the Persians. They formed an alliance called the Delian League, Athens and Sparta. Eventually, a king named Pericles came to power for Athens, and he turned Athens into the showplace of the world. He rebuilt the Acropolis. He built the Parthenos, buildings that still exist today. He glorified Athens. He used marble. He used columns to build buildings and this created jealousy between the Athenians and the Spartans, and this led to a civil war called the Peloponnesian War. The war goes on, and no one knows what happened and why they went to battle with them. But before the Peloponnesian War, we see the rise of cultural and classical Greek. They invent the concept of history, which means to research, and hopefully that's what you're doing on your research paper. You're researching. Herodotus is the father of history. He wrote the history of the Persian War. His son, Thucydides, his student, Thucydides is his successor, and he wrote the history of the Peloponnesian War. Now, I may have asked you this before, if you believe history repeated itself. Thucydides said no, because he believed that human nature was constant, and that because of the nature of man has not changed since he's been on this earth, he is prone to make the same mistakes over and over and over again, which gives the appearance that history is repeating itself. But it's not history, it's man repeating himself. So man repeats himself. History does not repeat itself. Now, also down at the Agora again, the center of town, a new art form developed that we are familiar with called drama. The first Greek dramas that developed was called tragedies, and they was based on the suffering of a hero and the ending usually ended in disaster. Most tragedies were done in trilogies, a series of three. The one that stands out to me is written by the playwright Sophocles called Oedipus, the King. In this play, the Oracle of Apollo foretells how a man named Oedipus will kill his father and marry his mother. And despite all attempts at prevention, the tragic event occurs. He kills his father on the battlefield and falls in love with his mother, who he never knew. So the Apollo came. This developed a concept called Oedipus complex. Boys are attracted to their mother. In fact, their mothers are the epitome of womanhood. Girls are attracted to their fathers. In fact, mostly their fathers represent manhood. So, Sophocles, Oedipus the King, is it's a three-part play. Other tragedies was written, Diocesan. Let's see who else I need to tell you about. Aristophanes, he came up with comedy. But now you understand when you watch TV, when you watch The Housewives of Atlanta or whatever, it is drama, soap operas, drama. And this art form was developed by the Greeks, the Athenians mainly. They also built architectural, unbelievable. I mentioned the Parthenon and other structures that they built during this particular time. The use of columns and as building blocks is important. They also perfected the art of sculpturing. If you notice, if you've seen in the Greek sculpture, they are in the nude. Genitalia, breasts are always on display. Again, the Greeks thought the body was a temple, something to behold. But they also developed the love of wisdom, philosophy. And the first three philosophers, the early philosophies, are called sophists. And they are Socrates, and Aristotle, and Plato. You've heard of them. Socrates left no writings, but we know about him from his pupil, especially the most famous one, Plato. He developed a teaching method that is still known today by the Socratic method, where an instructor asks questions that he already know the answer to get you to utilize your brain to think and to see the answers yourself. He questioned authority, and this soon led him into trouble. He was accused of corrupting the miners of Athens and forced to drink hemlock, so he was killed. His student or disciples was Plato. Plato is considered by many to be the greatest philosopher of the Western world. He dealt with idealism, an ideal state, a utopia. What we found out, and he found out later, that a utopia did not exist. Plato would be succeeded by his student, Aristotle, which had a major influence on Western philosophy. He played an enormous role in the development of Western thought during the Middle Ages. So too did the ideal on women. Aristotle believed that marriage was meant to provide mutual comfort between man and woman and contribute to the overall happiness of the community. In Greek religion, we already talked mythology, festivals, the Olympic Games arose when they went to entertain the gods that set up on top of Mount Olympus. So, the Greeks have given us history, government, and an art form, drama. They will continue to influence Western thought through these mediums. But let's go back to what I told you, before we go back. Let's talk about homosexuality. Male homosexuality was a prominent feature of the Athenian life. The Greek homosexual ideal was a relationship between a mature man and a young male. We would call it pedophilia today, but it was normal. Homosexuality was not frowned upon. It was considered to be normal by the Greeks and later the Romans. Okay, the Peloponnesian War had weakened the Greeks, and this left them susceptible to invasion. And from the north was a king called Philip of Macedonia. He defeated the Greeks at the Battle of Charenais. 2 years later, he is assassinated, and his son Alexander is elevated to the Greek throne. Alexander the Great is one of the remarkable personalities in world history. In 12 years, he conquered part of Europe and nearly all of Asia. His most noted achievement was the overthrowing of the 200-year-old Persian Empire and the spreading of Greek culture, language, and way of life called Hellenism. He created a new era called the Hellenistic period. Now, after his father was assassinated, he blamed the Persian, and he began a 3-year conquest against the Persian, finally defeating them at the Battle of Gaugamela. His troops refused to having overthrown the Persian Empire. He continued his march. He goes through Afghanistan, Pakistan, finally into India, where his troops refused to go further. He returns back to Baghdad, and at the age of 32, he dies, a very young man, but he had conquered the known world. His empire would be divided up among his 3 generals, but initially chaos broke out, civil war. He gave the huge kingdom of Egypt to the Ptolemies. He gave Garnitar Macedonian Asia Minor, and he gave Seleucus Mesopotamia, and they established monarchies. These monarchies built Hellenistic cities, but failed to grant the city-state sovereignty, and this led to conflict. The Hellenistic cities, though, was the basic social and political unit of the Hellenistic East until the 6th century. These cities were the chief agent of Hellenization. The cities formed the broader cultural network in which Greek language, custom, and values flow. Eventually, the lure of immigration ceased, and this led to stagnation of the Hellenistic world, and finally around 202 BC, it collapsed into favor of the rise of the young Roman Republic, which we're going to talk about next week. The Greeks in the East were a minority, but their dialect took over. Their dialect was called Koine. The real achievement of Alexander and the Greeks were linking East and West into a broad commercial network. Most trade was seaborne, slaves were a staple crop, but the Greeks period saw the spread of Greek religion into the East. The Greeks participated in the cult for cultural reason. They felt little genuine religious attachment to them. The Greeks increasingly sought solace from other sources. Educated people turned to philosophy as a guide to life. Others turned to superstitions, magic, or astrology. You know about astrology, your horoscope. Still others spoke of Tyche, which means fate, chance, or doom. Tyche. It'll be on your test. Fate, chance, or doom. Wrong place, wrong time. During this period, philosophy was in the province of the wealthy. However, during the Hellenistic period, philosophy reached out to touch the lives of the common man, to protect against Tyche. Many Greeks looked for philosophy for constellation. The main philosophies were Cynic, Epicurean, and Stoic. The Cynic urged to return to nature. The Cynic believed that rejecting material things, people became free and the natives would provide. Epicurean founded the school of Epicurus, the belief that the principal goal of human life is pleasure, which is defined by the absence of pain. The one that stands out are the Stoics, which was founded by Zeno, a Hellenized Phoenician. Stoicism became the most popular Hellenistic philosophy. Unlike the Epicurean, the Stoic taught that people should participate in politics and world affairs. The Stoic believed that people should do their duty to the state, the Stoics created the concept of natural law. Thus, this concept of one law for all people became a valuable tool for future Romans. This concept of natural law would be adopted by us, the Europeans, the Romans, etc. Where in every society you go in, there are certain natural laws like murder, stealing, lying. It doesn't matter where you are; those are violation of the natural order thing. As far as women folks, we saw a great expansion in social and economic opportunities for women. However, this development only touched wealthier women. But what we most remember about the Greeks is their contribution to science. Aristarchus was an astronomer who concluded that the sun was larger than the earth. He proposed the heliocentric theory that the earth and the planets revolved around the sun. Euclid, I think that's going to be your first question. He wrote a textbook entitled Elementary Geometry. Probably the greatest thinker and inventor of the Hellenistic period was Archimedes. He invented the Archimedes screw and the compound pulley. Everybody knows what a compound pulley. A seesaw on the playground is a good example of a compound pulley. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth. So, let's recap. The Greeks arrived, the Mycenaeans, the Minoans. They established city-states, Sparta, Athens. They fight the Persians. They fight among themselves. They're conquered by the Macedonians. This led to the rise of Alexander the Great. I'm sorry. I'm thinking about my book, Alexander Curtis. But art, architect, sculpture, government is what we most remember the Greeks for. Now, this is going to be it for this week. I checked your grade book. Most of you did extremely well on the test. I think you figured it out. Study your study guide, take the test. You have 3 more tests and 1 research paper. Get to work on your research paper. This is an A waiting for you to receive. Be blessed and have a good week.